And class is in session. You're listening to Shit Shooting 101. I'm your host, Joshua Lee. Joining us today, author of Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, Volumes 1 and 2, and Now is the Only Thing That's Real. His website is neilsandersmindcontrol.co.uk. He's a deep diver, daring the depths, braving the dark trenches of the murky and the tempestuous, drawing the line, delivering the lamp, dredging up the muddied history lost low so long at the seas of deception. Here to drag truth to the surface for re-examination, it's Neil Sanders. Neil, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. What an introduction. Fantastic.
All right, this is going to be a very cool discussion. We're falling down the rabbit hole of the Manson murders, which I've wanted to do a podcast on for such a long time. So this is going to be fascinating for me. Starting off, because most people, almost everything they think they know about the Manson murders comes from Helter Skelter of Vincent Bugliosi. And so I would like to start by examining Bugliosi. Who was he really?
Well, I mean, it looks like he was a very, it looks like he was quite the career climber, really. Like, I mean, he was the prosecutor in the Manson case, and he was desperately trying to become the district attorney, which, is a very high, lofty position and whatnot. The suggestion really is that he was a safe pair of hands. Like, he was somebody that the establishment knew. He was somebody that would make things sort of go away. And in regards to the Manson case, it looks like he was essentially tasked with creating a motive. I mean, he actually says it in Helter Skelter. I forget the exact wording, but he says something along the lines of, when you've got a case as fantastic as this, or as outrageous or as outlandish as this, then you need to have a motive that is similarly exotic, or similarly, like it's crazy sounding, which is one of those things where if you look at it in isolation, it's like, no, you really shouldn't have that. Still, you should have like sensible evidence and a narrative that works and stuff like that. But this was kind of the point with the Manson murders, was that it was very, very difficult to explain. It transpires that there was probably a very, very sort of simple reason for it, which was actually drugs. But the way that it was presented was that this was a random attack on members of the Hollywood elite by this person who's just got no connection to them at all, which is Manson. And the only way that they could sort of square that circle with the general public was to give the impression that this was like a cult hit, like a hippie cult death squad, essentially, that have been riled up by this religious maniac to believe something so incredibly crazy, essentially the concept of Helter Skelter, that there'd be a race war, that they'd go out and kill people at random. And these people so happened to be very famous people, Sharon Tate, the wife of Roman Polanski, and their entourage that was at the house at the time. So this is what Bugliosi was there to do. Bugliosi was essentially there to provide the mainstream with a narrative that they could explain this completely strange crime scene. Now, as a character, he's not a very nice person by all accounts. Like, it came out after after the case had died down and whatnot, and that he'd been able to sort of make a huge amount of money off the back of sales of the book. He was going, as I say, for the district attorney, and this was scuppered because it transpired that the man was clearly insane. He had this sort of obsession with this milkman, and he'd become convinced that this milkman, I think it was a milkman, was the father of one of his kids. There was no evidence to support this, and by all accounts, the guy was completely innocent. But he just got it into his head, and he harassed this person. He harassed this person to the point where I think law enforcement got involved, because this person stepped back and said, "So what on earth is this guy? Who is this crazy guy that keeps sort of bothering with me?" And the irony of the situation was that all this time that he's accusing his wife of having an affair, he's having affairs with his secretaries and stuff like that, and forcing them to have abortions against their will in sort of less than, I don't think they was taken off to sort of Beverly Hills clinics or anything. I think this was possibly an over the border to Mexico sort of job. So yeah, this is the thing. The Bugliosi the public perception of him is that he's the sort of like, you know, completely squeaky clean cut prosecutor in the Manson case. He's been dropped into an incredibly difficult situation, and through a combination of bravery, like, and determination, he's actually got to the bottom of the craziest crime of the century. But it actually transpires that in reality, he's probably a quite sleazy person, potentially with connections to the mafia, that has basically stepped up to help with the cover-up, essentially.
So why do you think he was chosen for the case, and by whom? The CIA, the mafia, both?
Well, I mean, that's one of the mysteries, isn't it? I mean, I think that there's a lot of suggestions that potentially there was mafia influence in it. The mafia influence comes from certain things that Manson said. For example, he intimated that Bugliosi had come to him with an offer from the Genovese crime family that essentially if he'd roll on everybody else, he'd get parole. And I forget, I think the exact quote is, he comes to me from Geneva and he offers to bring me sunshine if I just roll on, blah, blah, blah. And he makes a lot of metaphors around Manson makes a lot of metaphors around Lucky Luciano, who's obviously mafia, and the way that he was convicted using the lies of prostitute. And what he's making the comparison to there is Bugliosi being the mafia influenced person that got Linda Kasabian, the prostitute in inverted commas, to basically tell a pack of lies in order to get Manson convicted. But who he actually did it for is that's where it starts to get really murky, isn't it? Because basically, you know, there's your Los Angeles, the LAPD is your Los Angeles County sheriffs. They're basically both looking at different aspects of the case, both of them seemingly bungling the case. And if you were cynical from an outside sort of perspective, you could look at the way that the case was handled and go, it's almost as if they didn't want to solve the case. You know, they didn't find evidence that they did find was lost. There was no connection of crime scenes. There was no collaboration between the forces and stuff like that. So it would appear that basically all along the sort of the gamut, people are not wanting this to be solved. So I don't think that the court system or the prosecution services or anyone like that wanted too much digging. I don't think that the Hollywood elite wanted too much digging. I think certain producers like Robert Evans, who's surprisingly sort of influential. Robert Evans was a bit like a sort of Harvey Weinstein of the time, in as much as he's a mogul. Not that he's raped loads of women, although who knows, but basically in as much as that he's the person that gets stuff done, basically. Like, you know, by which I mean, like, Harvey Weinstein was, if it wasn't for Harvey Weinstein, you wouldn't have had Quentin Tarantino, you wouldn't have had Kevin Smith, you wouldn't have had numerous franchises and films that basically, you know, not that are beloved nowadays. You know, that's not to defend or to make out that Harvey Weinstein is in any way a decent human being. He's not. He's a terrible human being. But this is the function of a producer, and one of the producers that was very close to Polanski and very close to Sharon Tate was Robert Evans. Robert Evans was a very, very influential person within Hollywood, but also in the crime sort of world. The suggestions that he had connections to the mafia, that he was dealing cocaine, or even that he was connected in a sort of tangential sense to of all things, the Son of Sam murders, and the murder of another producer called Roy Radin, who essentially stiffed him and a friend of what's his name, the Wilson. Why is that? It just fell out of my head. Ocean Pacific Blue, the sexy beach boy, what's his name, the drummer, Dennis.
Oh, Dennis Wilson. Okay.
Yeah, my God, what's wrong with me? Dennis was friends with a woman called Lainey, I forget her name, Lainey something, Lainey Williams, I think was her name. She and Roy Radin and Frank Evans went in on a cocaine deal that went sour. And Roy Radin ended up being murdered by a bloke called Bill Mensa, who was a member of the Church of Satan, and some have accused him of being connected to the Son of Sam murders. Essentially, he shot this bloke's head off. Roy Radins shot his head off with a shotgun, then put a stick of dynamite in the wound, which was essentially his neck, blew his body up, and then covered him in lots of sort of satanic ritual artifacts and stuff, which is pretty cool. You know, if you're into sort of horror films and stuff like that, that's a fairly like extravagant crime scene. Anyway, so I digress. But the point being, so you've got people like producers, you've got there's a whole lot of people who've got a whole lot of very, very shady connections that really didn't want anybody to probe too deeply into the deaths of Sharon Tate and her companions. So who's directing Bugliosi? It's a bit of a mystery, basically. You can speculate. And I suppose if you look at who benefited from the actions, the cover-up, the sort of proliferation of helter-skelter, as opposed to looking at the crime as like a drug murder and involving like shifty characters like that. I suppose the drug dealers did well out of that. I suppose LA as a sort of city did quite well out of it. The mafia did well out of it. Hollywood certainly did well out of it. So that this is the problem. Too many people benefited from Bugliosi's actions, which probably means that they're never officially going to admit that Helter Skelter is a deeply, deeply flawed theory. And it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny, to be quite honest.
Right. There's so many connections, and that spider web seems to catch almost everybody of that time period. So moving along here, there's a lot of lore built up around Charles Manson himself. So looking at him, if you could help us separate the myth of Charles Manson from who he really was.
Well, I mean, that again is pretty difficult, to be quite honest. I mean, a lot of the sort of the things that are about him that are sort of attributed that are considered mythic would be, and this is how I got into Manson, got interested in, because I was interested in the topic of mind control, by which I mean, controlling people through the use of hypnosis, or controlling people through drugs or manipulation, sort of cult-like techniques. But really, I was interested in the sort of military applications and the some declassified CIA operations like MK Ultra and stuff like that, which is one of these things. It sounds really, really sort of science fictiony, but if you look at it, there's a surprising amount of documentation that governments did experiment with these things and actually got some quite convincing results out of it. And off the back of that, there was always like this idea. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Mae Brussel idea of Operation Chaos. There's this concept. Mae Brussel was a radio host in the 60s and 70s, and she was actually really, really good investigative journalist into sort of more conspiratorial stuff, but she really was sort of, she found out stuff about, say, the Son of Sam killings and stuff like that didn't come out for years later, and she's got a pretty good track record of being fairly tenacious in her investigations. She had the idea that Charles Manson was part of a broader operation to sort of smear hippies and smear the association of hippies, because like it's not really hippies per se, it was really more the sort of the student anti-war movement. And she had an idea that basically Charles Manson was a mind-controlled or like an agent provocateur that had been sent into that sort of realm and had encouraged people to be violent, or had agreed to take the blame for violent crimes in order to basically make hippies look bad. And that is an interesting take on it, because that's certainly what happened. But why I think that happened is not to do with the fact that Manson was actually encouraged to do that, but more that basically they smeared him afterwards. And the smearing of Manson, the concept of Manson being an anti-establishment hippie guru cult leader, didn't actually really come from it did come from the press, but where it got its legitimization within the counterculture and the sort of that element of people who were following the case was through the Weather Underground. Bernardine Van Doren of the Weather Underground, who was supposedly this sort of terrorist organization that basically was anti-capitalist and anti-government, that had come off the back of the SDS and risen at the same time as the Black Panthers. They announced Charles Manson to be, I think they gave him Man of the Year, and they said that basically 1969, 69 was the year of the fork, and this was a reference to the fork that was left in Leonardo LaBianca's stomach during when he was murdered. But basically they said something along the lines of, dig it, they went into those rich pigs' house and they killed them, and they ate dinner whilst the bodies were still warm, or some quote that was very, very similar to that. So the myth of Manson was being sort of built up before the court case had even started, that before anybody had a chance to hear him speak, and in fact no one really did get a chance to hear him speak. They'd already cultivated this image of Charles Manson as being a revolutionary cult leader that believed that there was going to be a war between the black people and the white people, which the black people would win, and then he'd go off and hide with his acolytes and his disciples in the desert until their number grew to 144,000, and then they'd come back and they'd take over. And in order to start this revolution, they were murdering white people and leaving clues that it was black people that had killed these folks, to spur on this this civil war. And again, all of that came out from, well, three sources really. One was Susan Atkins, who was involved with the Tate murder, and she, with her lawyers, had actually produced essentially a novel. It was a novelization. It was a book that came out as a novel called The Killing of Sharon Tate, and it was also serialized in the local newspaper. And it told essentially the story of her getting involved with this cult and eventually being spurred on to commit these murders with Tex and various other people. Now, this came out before the trial started, so the idea of Charlie or anybody getting a fair trial when that had happened is ridiculous. And it wasn't just that had been released to the press. Several things had been sort of given out. They'd spoken to Danny DiCarlo, who was a straight-sentence motorcyclist who was sort of connected vaguely to the Manson group, and he'd very heavily intimated that Charles Manson was a racist, and he'd shown evidence in inverted commas of sort of Nazi type pamphlets and stuff that were found at Spahn Ranch, which is where they're staying now. A lot of people pointed out that these weren't found anywhere near where Charlie was staying. These were actually found where Danny DiCarlo was staying and where the Straight Satans sometimes bunked and stuff like that. And there was no real evidence that they were his, essentially, but the myth was born again, that he was a white supremacist or a Nazi that hated black people. Now, to be fair, there's an element of truth to that, because essentially Manson, he'd be considered racist certainly by today's standards, and there was varying, attitudes were very, very different. Now, even at the time, basically, he didn't think that white people and black people should mix, which is a stupid concept, but it was a different time. However, upon reading Squeaky's book, she says that even at the time she thought that Manson was a little bit racist, but she took that to be because he was 20 years older, or 15 years older than the rest of them. He's in his mid-30s or early 30s, and they're all 17, 18 or whatever. So it's kind of speaking to your dad's mate or whatever. And of course their attitude is going to be different and less cool and less up to date, particularly because he just spent the majority of his life in prison as well. He's not actually he's not actually been on the streets. So thus far, we've got the myth perpetuated by Susan Atkins that he's a cult leader, that Helter Skelter is a real thing. You've got the myth perpetuated by Danny DiCarlo that he's a Nazi. You've got the myth perpetuated by Paul Watkins, which is the concept of why Helter Skelter was a thing. And essentially this was the idea that Charlie thought he was Jesus, and that he thought that basically, as I said, there was going to be a war between the black population and the white population. And so him and his acolytes would go off into the desert and they'd survive, come out of it later, and take over the world because they'd have the experience. That came from Paul Watkins, but it's nothing to do with Charlie. It's actually the story of a different Gory that died in Box Canyon about 20 years prior to Charlie being there, called Krishna Ventnor. And Krishna Ventnor, basically, what happened was Paul Watkins took the story of Krishna Ventnor, who was this crazy cult leader that basically stole a load of women off like local sort of people that were like, you know, kind of sort of hillbilly types, told all these women that he was Jesus, and he took them back to his compound and encouraged them all to have orgies. And the reason that he was doing this was because he felt there was going to be a race war between, you know, the whites and the blacks, and that they would have to go and hide out in the you know, the canyon until their numbers grew. This is the story that was basically appropriated to Charles Manson. It was nothing to do with Charles Manson. It was Krishna Ventnor, and it didn't work out terribly well for him because basically the husbands of the women turned up, found him there like having orgies with his wife, and blew them all up with dynamite. So this is the strange thing about Manson, is that basically there's so many, all the things that people know about him have come mostly from other people, either from Linda Kasabian on trial, either from Susan Atkins in her book, either from Paul Watkins telling the stories that was essentially the Krishna Ventnor cool aspect of it, Danny DiCarlo, giving the idea that he was again more sort of powerful than he was, and more into Nazism than he was, and these are the things that's the thing that everybody knows about Manson. That's the construct of him. He's a hippie cult leader. He's clearly a Nazi because he's got a swastika on his forehead, and you know, he hated black people, and he wanted to start a cult basically because there was going to be a race war. And the thing is that none of that's true. Literally none of it's true at all. Like he didn't have any sort of special mind control powers over his acolytes. He couldn't hypnotize you just by looking at you. You know, he didn't actually even use drugs in the sense to dominate people in the way that you know, some people have suggested. Well, he wasn't taking acid and everyone else was taking acid. I don't think that's true at all. I think that again, that's just myths to make it seem a bit more sort of sensational. What was Charlie Manson? Well, Charlie Manson was a sort of low-level criminal, drug dealer, and he was a pimp. He was trained as a pimp. So any sort of aspect of control that he would have over these girls, this group of girls with him that would sleep with him and sleep with other people at his command, essentially, it's far more reasonable, and it's far more sort of actually makes far more sense to look at it that, oh, he's not a cult leader, like he's a pimp, and these girls are essentially like his stable. You've got Linda, and you've got, you know, you've got Squeaky, and you've got Brenda, and you've got Sandra, and all these attractive young girls basically, like, and you know, with attractive young girls, you can get quite a long way. And you know, throughout his life, it was shown that if Charles Manson had one thing going for him, okay, it was the gift of the gab, particularly with women. Like he seemed to have a particular sort of skill for finding young women, young vulnerable women that have been essentially kicked out by the parents, been abandoned by society essentially, and making them feel special, and making them feel like they are human beings. And I'm not naive. An aspect of that is manipulation. Of course, he's getting out what he wants out of it. But this is the strange thing that everyone seems to miss about Charles Manson, was that these kids who are all damaged kids, these kids who are also like, you know, runaways and people who've been really unfairly treated by their parents and had a really bad time of it and whatnot, he protected them and he treated them with respect. He built them up and made them into human beings. Like, now, was everything that he did right? No, it wasn't. But this portrayal of Manson as completely nasty, horrible, in it for his own self, manipulator of young minds and stuff like that, it's not as straightforward or as simple as that by any stretch of the imagination. Like he was, you know, they were a group of friends. They weren't a cult. They were a group of outcasts. Did he use his worldly wiles and the fact that he's got more world experience than everyone, and the fact that he is a bit of a cutthroat criminal, essentially, to his advantage? Yeah, of course he did. Absolutely, of course he did. But is he a cult leader that was mind controlling children in order for them to start a race war? No. No, sadly, it's not as interesting as that.
Yeah, as much as they try to lead us to believe that he was a master hypnotist of people, it's like if they really believe that, why on God's green earth would they put him on television twice a year for the rest of his life to hypnotize all of the world?
Well, what happened was, like, there was a story that came out, and this is nonsense because I'll tell you why it's nonsense. Like, it wouldn't work. Like, there was this concept that what he'd done is he'd recorded something, or he tapped into this radio thing at one of the prisons that he was at, and he was speaking through it whilst all the other inmates were asleep. And he was able to influence them with, like, hypno programming whilst they were asleep. Now, that story's been repeated quite a lot, and it's usually given as indication that this is Manson and evidence of it. It wouldn't work. I don't know if you remember this, but there used to be a bit of a fad for these, like, learn Spanish whilst you sleep, learn this whilst you sleep. Those sort of tapes that you put on, right? They don't work. None of them work. Like, they just don't work. Now, I'm actually a trained hypnotherapist. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist. In order to get into somebody's brain like that with influence, which can be done through hypnosis, it's pointless if the person's asleep. It just won't work. The brain waves aren't in a receptive state. Like, so they just, you won't remember it. This is why people can't remember dreams and stuff like that, because it's just, it won't work. So this idea that was just was nonsense. There was an idea that he was that actually, this is quite serious. Like, the concept was that, well, people say in prison he read that Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and that's where he learned all his chops, how to sort of manipulate people and stuff like that. And it's like, what on earth do you think is in that book? Or, like, it's not that. Like, all the book really tells you is be polite to people. Now, here's what's interesting. You can definitely see in interviews and in interactions with Charles Manson and other people that he's taken that book on board and he uses it. And there's several principles in it. Like, for example, you always ask questions about somebody. You show that you're interested. You ask the person's name and you keep repeating the name so that it sticks in your head, and so that this makes the other person think, oh, he keeps repeating my name, I'm obviously important. If you get something wrong, you apologize immediately and profusely. You don't try and wriggle out of it. You say, no, that was me, I was wrong, that was my fault. And so there are elements in conversations with Manson where you look at it and you go, right, okay, fair enough. We can definitely see that he's got an influence there. Now, the other influence on his character actually came from Scientology, but kind of bootleg Scientology. Like, he was trained by this bloke called Lania Raymer. And the guy had claimed to know L. Ron Hubbard and claimed to be like a really high level Scientologist. He claimed to be an operating thetan. And what an operating thetan is like Tom Cruise is apparently an operating thetan. It means that you can manifest things with your thoughts. You can essentially read people's minds and you can move stuff. You're telekinetic. Like, now, apparently, the way that Tom Cruise has proven this is true, apparently. Tom Cruise can manifest a zit on his face just with the power of his mind. I know. What a skill to have. Like, that's apparently, I read that some actress had said that, oh, I've watched him do it. It's incredible. But what happened was, in Scientology, you do this thing called, I can't remember what it's called, auditing, where it's almost like sort of psychoanalysis, but it's a very sort of crude and rather cruel psychoanalysis. But what it does, once you've been through this programming is it makes you incredibly sort of you've got like an armor against the world. They do these things like, which are called, I can't remember what they're called, SR techniques, I think they're called, or something like that. And they're basically, for example, one of them is called bull baiting. And what happens is you just sit down and you walk up, someone keeps coming up to you and just insulting you and just telling you stuff about yourself that you don't want to know. And the skill in Scientology is to just shut yourself off and to not care what the other person says. And you might have seen this in, like, you know, with Scientologists where like reporters or whatever are screaming and shouting at them and they're kind of just looking straight through them and they're smiling and it's like nothing bothers them. That is something that, again, you can definitely see in Charles Manson. You can see in numerous interactions that he's had with prison guards, with various other people. Like, there's a very famous one where it's like, you know, haha, you're in jail now. And it's like, I'm not in jail. I'm just here. I'm just me. Like, he had this concept of wherever he is, he's absolutely fine because he's living in the now, which is actually a Scientology phrase, as far as I'm aware. So Charlie said that Scientology cured his depression. And again, certain things like, there's stories of him doing this sort of matching dance where he goes up to the girls and goes, follow my hands and follow my facial expressions. And there's also the very famous interview where he's asked, who are you? And he does all those crazy faces and then he just says, I'm nobody. Those are, again, SR techniques that are learned by Scientologists. These are ways of I think the expression is coming to now, but essentially, like, it's a way of training your mind to be impervious to the outside world. And although the chap that trained Charlie wasn't a legitimate Scientologist, and although Charlie had never actually been to the sort of Scientology center or anything like that, he did use the principles in what he deemed to be a very, very positive way. So these are the sort of the disparate things that are sort of making up his personality and making him into the person that he was. A lot of his personality as well came from basically the abject poverty and misery that he was brought up with. His mother wasn't really terribly great at being a mother. He was battered around between sort of uncles and aunts and grandparents and stuff like that, had limited education, got into criminal activities very early on. At one point, basically, to toughen him up, I always forget whether it was his uncle or his grandfather. I think it was his grandfather sent him to school dressed as a girl so that he'd definitely get into a fight to toughen him up and stuff like that. There was an incident where basically he was being picked on by the neighborhood kids at Christmas because he didn't have any, he wasn't going to get any gifts and he was a lot poorer. So he went house to house, burglarizing their presents and then set them all on fire. So, you know, troubled kid, definitely. And particularly miserable upbringing. And then throughout his life, he's just, what molded him as a criminal was one, basically he got caught giving a bad check. Like, he cashed a stolen check, and then he got caught with his wife, or prior to that he got caught with his wife taking a car over state lines and stuff like that. He wasn't a particularly accomplished criminal until all of a sudden he met a few people in prison, essentially, and he met Frank Carbo and he met Frank Costello, and these are very, very sort of like prominent members of the mafia. And although these were very sort of quite short relationships, particularly with Frank Costello, they were very, very influential on him because Frank Costello was known as the Prime Minister of crime. And, like, you know, it's like, I don't know, if you're a young American footballer or whatever, football player, okay, and you bump into Tom Brady or someone, do you know what I mean? He's like, oh, this bloke is everything that I ever wanted to be. Like, and Tom Brady, I've got that name right. I'm sorry. Like, if
yeah, you get it.
Excellent. So, and what happened was that Frank Costello basically advised the young Charlie, you know what, you know, if you're going to do something, do it well. And he taught, after this liaison, Charlie got involved with an automotive, garage type setup, learning how to mend cars, learning how cars worked and stuff like that. But what he's really learning is how to start cars without keys. And then as soon as he's out of prison, he's doing two things. One, he's down in Texas, I think it was in Laredo, and he's running girls there, which is the sort of thing that basically, you know, you need to have the tacit approval of organized crime. You can't just roll up in a town. You know, this concept that rappers have now, like checking in or whatnot. It's not, it's kind of like that, basically. You're not going to turn up in someone else's turf and start doing major crimes like pimping without attracting a certain amount of attention. And then later on, he's got pimping agencies in Hollywood, like a 3-star. And his partner at the time there was a gentleman called Tony Cassini. Tony Cassini was also mafia, like he's proven to be mafia. So you can now, there's Charles Manson, he's not in the mafia, he's not a mafia association, he's got the connection to the mafia is fairly sort of low level, but it's enough for him to know who they are and to sometimes get involved with aspects of drug dealing or moving stolen cars or pimping that have a tangential connection to the mafia, essentially. And then when he's out in the 60s, the things that he's doing is as I say, the girls and the clique that he's got together, the family, as they would be called, I think it's far more sort of like makes far more sense if you look at them as like he's pimping these girls out, essentially. Maybe not completely sort of like crack the whip sort of stuff, but like, you know, he has that as an option. He's also dealing drugs to certain people. For example, Dean Martin, it is apparently he was dealing cocaine to him at times. And at the same time, they've got this chop shop going. They've got this chop shop going in the Spahn Ranch, where they're sort of converting Volkswagens and Porsches and stuff into like dune buggies, or they're stealing the engines and sort of moving them on. And then there's an aspect of that a lot of people don't sort of seem to make the connection. Is like, well, if he's already pimping, he's already selling drugs, and he's already there, and he's got dune buggies, why would he need dune buggies? Oh, right, yeah, because you can go across the desert and get to Mexico, and you can transport drugs backwards and forwards, and you can go to places that the police can't go to, because, you know, they're far more maneuverable and whatnot. So I think it would be naive to discount that as a huge possibility. And then the other influence that the mafia had was through, I can't remember his bloody name now, not Frankie Cohen, Mickey Cohen. Mickey Cohen, his cellmate, it was Charles Manson's cellmate during his last stint in prison, was Frank Creepy Carpus, who was a sort of organised criminal bank robber, part of the Mar Barker gang, and he had connections to Mickey Cohen, and he'd written to Mickey Cohen a couple of times on Manson's behalf, saying essentially, you know, when this guy gets out of prison, do us a favour, try and hook him up with some gigs or whatever. And then he went to, when Charles Manson got out of prison, he went to certain pubs and clubs in the sort of San Francisco area that were definitely sort of under the auspices of Mickey Cohen and that sort of angle of the mafia. And he wasn't actually offered gigs, but he was given gigs in other places off the back of that. And then the other sort of aspect of it is that very, very quickly, after he's been released in the 60s, late 60s, he's introduced to a gentleman called Gary Stromberg. Gary Stromberg is very influential in MGM Studios, I think it is, in Hollywood. So he's already getting offers for sort of like gigs and potentially music projects and film projects, and, you know, he's nestling with sort of quite movers and shakers in the Hollywood scene, potentially supplying with drugs. As I say, Gary Stromberg tried to get him involved with this film where Jesus came back to America, but happened to be a black guy. And the rumor that was proliferating, again, as part of this myth that Manson hates black people, was that he quit because there's no way Jesus was black. That's not strictly true. The project just sort of fizzled into nothingness, as, you know, many Hollywood projects do. But these are the influences on Charles Manson's life. It's like, you know, horrible upbringing, forced essentially into a life of crime, Scientology, which helps him, connections to certain organized crime figures that basically almost sort of mold his criminal career path down the route of pimping and down the route of car theft. And that's what we see. Like, this is what we see. We don't see a cult leader. we see somebody that's come out of prison in a very tumultuous time in US history, that stumbled across a load of kids that perhaps he sees a bit of himself in, like that sort of concept of, like, you know, abandoned by society. But he's also seen these kids who are naive and young, he can use them for his own advantage. And before you know it, he's got like a little harem of girls that he has the option to pimp out. He has access to drugs like marijuana in large quantities and cocaine in large quantities and speed, later through associations with straight Satan's motorcycle group and stuff like that. And this is what he's doing. Like, later he gets offers for music projects through Brother Records and various people that wanted to promote him as almost like a sort of new Bob Dylan figure. And then, unfortunately, you know, Tex came along and started messing everything up, as Tex had a sort of a reputation for doing, basically.
One thing I wanted to ask you, do you know much about the Esalen Institute and why Charles Manson was there days before the murders happened?
Well, the conspiracy theory is that basically the Esalen Institute was started, I can't remember his name, this guy from the Tavistock Institute, Kurt Lewin, who was an ex-OSS officer and part of the Frankfurt School, and then basically was running the Tavistock Institute, which is psychological operations in the UK. It's the mental health institutions and stuff like that. And he actually helped found the National Institute of Mental Health, the Esalen Institute. I think he was something to do with MIT and Stanford Research Laboratory. So he's very, very sort of like influential mover and shaker. Now, the conspiracy theory is that to a degree, all of these institutions might have been involved with mind control. And there is an element of truth to that, in as much as in the Haight-Ashbury district, there was a bloke called Jolly West who was there to study the hippie in their natural environment. And he was a CIA operative, and he also made sort of a lot of noises about how drugs can be used in a prohibitive sense, by which they mean get kids addicted to drugs, make it so that their drugs are freely available to kids, and you can use them in a number of ways. You can either bust them and turn them into informers. You can hold that charge over them forever, like as a sort of blackmail threat. You can get them hooked onto certain drugs. All of this can be used to direct people away from sort of protesting against the government and stuff like that. And part of this, I forget the exact phrase, it was something like, it wasn't the New Age movement, but it was that kind of thing. And a lot of, which was things like yoga and self-improvement and, you know, hippie stuff, essentially. Now, the CIA were definitely looking at this as a sort of potential way to see if it could control people. Did it? Difficult to say. Like, the other thing that the CIA were involved in was basically spreading the LSD. So people like Owsley Stanley and various other people, Timothy Leary and other people like that would hugely, Ronald Stark and the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. These were all proven to be CIA operatives, or at the very least, like assets of the CIA. So there's some connection with the Central Intelligence Agency and the proliferation of LSD at the time. And this all kind of ties in. And this is where the conspiracy theories start to sort of wash over one another, essentially, because you've got, you know, Esalen Institute, yes, definitely something to do with the CIA, in as much as they're watching people who are going there and they're trying to see if there's anything interesting that could come out of it. And this is where you get the concept that potentially maybe Charles Manson was this, you know, this Operation Chaos mind control agent, but I don't think he was. I think they used him after the fact to smear hippies and go, you see, this is what will happen. You let your kids hang around with hippies and they'll end up like drug-addled lunatics that will murder, like, you know, Sharon Tate, essentially. So it was used like that. But was there any sort of influence? Not really. And the other connection to the Esalen Institute was Gibby, what's her bloody name? Gibby Folger. She worked there. And also for a time, one of Manson's parole officers also was connected to that sort of.
Roger Smith, was that his
That's the
name?
guy. Yeah, that's him. Like Roger Smith, the most ineffectual parole officer in the entire planet. Like Charles Manson's come out and he's supposed to get gainful employment and a place to live, and he didn't get either of those ever. And whilst he's out on parole, he's accused of rape, statutory rape. He's caught with drugs a number of times. He's caught with weapons a number of times. He's getting into fights, one in which he cuts the ears off a pimp. Like, and he's not a quiet character, and yet somehow he managed to sort of evade all of this. And this is where, again, a lot of people would say, well, that's because he's a CIA operative. But what I think is, and I would say it's not necessarily all me, this comes a lot of it comes from Nicholas Schreck's work, which is excellent. But the idea is that potentially, he's got friends in high places, so to speak, and that's not law enforcement or the intelligence agencies, that's organized crime. Just prior to Manson being released onto the streets, and he had an encounter which has never been adequately explained. There was a lawyer whose name I believe is George Shibley, or if I'm remembering correctly. And he was deeply, deeply connected to the mafia. At the time, I think he was charged like $250 an hour, which in the 60s is like mental money, like completely mental money. And he had several meetings with Charles Manson just prior to his release from prison in the late 60s. Never, ever been adequately explained. Never even tried to explain what could have been the reason for that. But this is the point. He's like something is putting him into contact and rubbing shoulders with all these movers and shakers. And there's several ways of looking at it. The conspiratorial way of looking at it is that's because he's a CIA operative going out there to destroy the hippie movement. Or the perhaps slightly more grounded and sensible thing is that he's obviously got some sort of connection to organized crime. And these are people that basically, it's not like they're setting up, they're just giving him advice. It's like I was watching The Wire the other day, right? Okay. And when Cutty comes home from prison, phone this number and somebody will hook you up with something. It's just as straightforward as that. But you've got to have that connect in the first place. Otherwise, they're never going to hook you up with anything, really, are they? So this is the thing. But this is why he's such a fascinating character, Manson, because basically there is so many different aspects of it that are sort of layered on top of it and layered on top of it and layered on top of it. Like one of the things that initially, when I first started looking at it, or when I first got really interested in it, was this was the idea that he was actually satanic in some way, that they were connected to the Process Church of Final Judgment. I'm sure you've heard that concept, like Ron de Grimston. Who was the leader of this cult called the Process Church of Final Judgment, who were basically, they felt that God and Satan were the same entity, and that basically they felt that orgies were a good thing, and they all used to wander around Hollywood in black capes and looking, like your sort of quintessential Satanist and whatnot. And they did sort of meet with the Manson group on a number of occasions. And another sort of conspiratorial angle was that these murders were ritual in nature, and that they were somehow connected to the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Which is a fascinating idea. Like these guys used to wander around with massive great Alsatian dogs, all dressed in black, with this sort of strange sort of quasi crucifix logo dangling from the necks, looking pretty damn impressive, to be quite honest. And that is, again, it's like that would be fascinating if these were connected. There's even some people that basically said that it was Roman Polanski, like that he was somehow involved, that either as punishment or as part of paying his dues or something like that, that his wife was and his infant son, obviously, as well, was sacrificed as part of this sort of ritual. That's nonsense. It's all nonsense, which is a real shame, because it would be fascinating, but it comes again from various places. The idea that it might be satanic in nature came from basically the day after the first murders. There was somebody had put a towel over J.C. Bring's face, Whether it was put there on purpose or whether it was just sort of dropped and it fell across his face, nobody's really quite sure. But this was misinterpreted in the press as all the victims were hooded. One of the headlines said something like, I think it's 5 dying ritual slaying or something like that. And so this was sort of extrapolated, and a lot of people went, oh wow, no, it's obviously some sort of satanic cult. And then, you know, you tie the idea of a cult leader who thinks that he's the devil and Jesus and stuff like that, and it's not too far of a stretch for people to go, okay, that makes sense. And the problem is, though, that the actual story connecting the Process Church of Final Judgment to the Manson family actually came from the UK tabloid press. What happened was, Manson's a Scientologist. He'd written on several forms that he's a Scientologist. Bruce Davis was a Scientologist. I think Brooks Poston was a Scientologist, and I'm pretty sure there was a couple of others who dabbled in Scientology that were connected to the Manson group. And this was found out specifically because Bruce Davis had actually been working in the Scientology Centre in London before being kicked out for using drugs. So the UK press picked up on this. They went to the Church of Scientology going, oh, this Manson nutter, this killer that's floating around, he's Scientologist, is he? And they went, no, nothing to do with us. And they realized it would be incredibly bad press. But they also realized that a group of Scientologists had broken off just the year before, and they'd gone off to Grimston and his pals. They went off to form the Process Church, which has got similar ideas to Scientology, but but different. And so they thought, well, brilliant, we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We'll disassociate ourselves from Charlie, and we'll basically smear this group that we don't like. So they put out loads of stories in the UK press, in the tabloid papers, saying Charles Manson is a Satanist. We know he's a Satanist because he's involved with this Process Church of Final Judgment group, who are also Satanists. And none of it was true. But again, it's a sexy story. It's the sort of thing that plays with a lot of different crowds and stuff like that. And it also tied into this idea that was put around by this bloke called Larry White Rabbit, who was at one time very vague association with the group, the Manson group. But basically, he made stuff up with reporters to make himself seem important. And he came up with the idea, or proliferated the idea, that there was a series of films that were made by the Manson group. They'd stolen some film equipment from, did they get it from the crashed plane? I think they got it from the plane crash. There was a plane that crashed very near to the ranch, and they found the wreckage, and I think they got the cameras from there, but I may be completely wrong about that. But the long and short of it is that basically there was rumors that home videos were made by the Manson group of murders of people on a beach, and that actually these were ritualistic in nature, and that they descended into sort of blood-covered orgies. And again, sadly, none of this is true. The element of truth to it is that the Manson entourage appeared to be making films in Malibu and at Dennis Wilson's house and at various other places throughout the sort of, Los Angeles area. But it would look like they were making porn films, essentially. Like there seemed to be a group that basically, Dennis Wilson and Gary Stromberg and what's his bloody name? Candice, owned the house before Polanski moved in there.
Oh, Terry Melcher.
Thank you, Terry Melcher. Like there's this ongoing party between these guys and also at Mama Cass's house, and all of these things, you're getting instances of either sexual acts being filmed or sexual acts being shown on not a VCR, because VCRs didn't exist at that point, but some sort of very, very sophisticated for the time playback device. And yeah, it looks like basically a lot of them were. There was like a constant drug party that was going on, and when it got to certain times, it looks like films were being made, and it looks like people like Jane Fonda might have been involved in these films. Certainly, people like Peter Sellers and Warren Beatty, and this ties into the concept that basically, I mean, this was shown to be true, that certain celebrity porn films were actually found at the Tate house and were stolen by members of the Los Angeles Police Department, who later tried to then sell them on. And as I say, they involved things like Peter Sellers and Warren Beatty. I think it was Sharon Tate and the Black Chauffeur, and then there was an orgy that involved Mama Cass and Yul Brynner and various other people. And again, like these have been alluded to by various people throughout involved in the case throughout the years, including Manson himself. Like, this is what's fascinating about Manson that I find, is that basically, you know, once you've sort of kind of decoded how he speaks, because he speaks in riddles and he speaks in sort of euphemisms and nicknames and stuff like that. He's surprisingly revealing in a lot of his interviews. Like, he basically kind of, like the Michael Bain Horan interview, he gets really cross with her and he says something along the lines of, fine, I'll tell you exactly what happened. Like when Lucky Luciano was lied to on the stand by the prostitute, and everybody all covered it up so that Rambo could come to make Hollywood films and stuff like that. And what he's alluding to there is that basically the mafia involvement in not only the sort of film studios, but also certain big Italian stars like Sylvester Stallone and Al Pacino and stuff like this. And this ties in with, you know, a lot of Hollywood lore. Frank Sinatra was another one who's sort of intimately connected to the case through various people, like you know, it was Frank Sinatra's girlfriend who just so happened to get the confession from Susan Atkins in prison and stuff like that. Frank Sinatra was connected to Brother Records and Reprise Records, and he was also on the supposed Manson hit list. But this is why all of these things, this is what's so fascinating about it, is that there's a lot of sort of truths and half-truths that are mashed together in order to sort of paint a picture that's the truth is in there if you sort of wiggle through it, basically. Like, for example, the connection is to do with Lucky Luciano and Johnny Rosselli and the Fischetti brothers and stuff like that. Those are the people who were, and later Sam Giancana. Like, these are the people that basically owned Frank Sinatra. Like, you know, The Godfather, the Johnny Fontaine character is actually based on Sinatra. You know, the story of, I'll make him an offer that he can't refuse. That refers to Johnny Rosselli. I don't know if it was him or one of his enforcers, went to this big band leader called William Dorsey, I think was his name, and he owned the contract for Frank Sinatra. And Johnny Rosselli went, click, click, no, you don't anymore. Like, I own it, and just took him, basically. And then later, Sam Giancana kind of became his sort of keeper, so to speak, and they got you know, that in Godfather 2, where Fredo takes like $1 million to Colombia, to Cuba. That was Frank Sinatra did that, under being protected by the Fischetti brothers. He was transporting laundered money for the mafia, and also basically they had him on call. They're like, Frank, come down here right now and sing My Way. There's two people who want to see it, and they just, if the mafia said jump, Frank Sinatra jumped, and apparently was terrified of them for the entirety of his career. So this is the thing. But again, it's those sort of connections to the entertainment industry and to organized crime, and these you know, these ideas of myths that are sort of painted on top of one another. And it's fascinating. What the Manson story really is, it's not a story of a hippie cult leader, which is how it's presented to the public, a racist hippie cult leader that killed completely random innocent people in order to start this insane civil war. That's not what it is at all. Okay, what it is it's a slight sort of insight into the grimy underbelly of Hollywood and the drugs culture and the sex culture and the corruption culture, and how organized crime intertwines with this, and intertwines with the drug trade, and intertwines with the huge amounts of money that these studios are making, and stuff like that, basically. So I actually think that once you sort of start pulling on the threads, the true story, so to speak, which is essentially, it was a grubby drug murder that was done by Tex in order to raise some money to get a lawyer for Bobby. Okay. As opposed to this cult thing. I think it's even more fascinating, to be quite honest, because you've not only got the crime level of it, and you've got the sort of seedy underbelly, like, you know, you've got Billy Doyle, the drug dealer, who's providing this MDA drug that Wojtek Wachowski is going to sell, and he's already sold $1,000's worth of it to Linda Kasabian and Tex that's turned out to be shite, or it's not very good quality. He gets then raped by Wojtek at Mama Cass's house the night before Wojtek is murdered, and it's filmed and it's watched on by Michelle Phillips, who's married to the Mums and the Papas, and Cass Elliott's there, and Dennis Hopper's there, and like, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's like, you know, you've got earlier stories of like, this is a year before apparently he knows any of them, but a year prior to like in 1967, like so over a year before he's supposed to have met any of these influential people, he's singing at Terry Melcher's house at a party with Nancy Sinatra and Dina Martin, and Dina Martin leaves the party because there's too much pot smoke and everyone's taking the mickey out of her, and so there's all these fascinating little like stories and intricacies. Charles Manson bumping into or being introduced to Michael Caine by Mama Cass at a party that's being held at Elvis Presley's house, that Noel Redding and Ginger Baker also happen to be. Oh no, it's not Ginger Baker. Who's the other guy? The drummer from the Jimi Hendrix Experience. That like they're all there as well and stuff like that. And it's just, again, I just find all of that stuff like fascinating. It's absolutely just fascinating. Really, you can't get more salacious than that, can you? Like it's Hollywood stars and it's sex and it's drugs and it's murder. What do you want?
Yeah, you mentioned Frank Sinatra's connection, Dean Martin, how Manson was dealing coke to him, and to complete the Rat Pack, Sammy Davis Jr. was dating Doris Day, Terry Melcher's mother.
Yes.
And
yeah.
You know, I always wondered, in that video that is rumored to have happened at the Polanski house, the black guy that was with Sharon Tate, because there's this one, I wish I would have saved this, but there was one interview with Manson where he mentions Terry Melcher's mom's boyfriend being involved in that. And so I wondered if perhaps that was kind of like a hint to it being Sammy Davis Jr., who was a proud Satanist, by the way.
Well, yes, that's very true. Yeah, I mean, that's the other angle, isn't it? The Satanist angle as well. Like on the night of the murders, Anton LaVey did a ritual to curse the hippie movement,
Right.
which a lot of people take as like, well, it evidently worked. And he was also involved. He apparently cursed the manager of Jane Mansfield, was it? And
right.
Well, she was beheaded in the crash.
Well, according to his telling.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Because he's a bit of a salesman, he's Anton LaVey.
Right.
But what's interesting about the Doris Day connection as well is that he's never been sort of proven or whatever, but like Manson has intimated that he might have had a bit of a fling with Doris Day as well.
Oh, really?
Well, some people have suggested, and I think this is a bit more of a sort of people who are trying to be a bit apologist for Terry Melcher, because obviously Terry Melcher actually, despite the official story is, I don't really know this guy, like he showed me his music, it was all right, blah blah blah, etc. I wasn't that bothered, and people say that his rejection by Terry Melcher was the reason that spurred him onto this insanity. This is not true. Terry Melcher and had planned to. They were doing a documentary film. Manson was going to be a major project, and the group was called Charles Manson and the Family Charles Manson and the Family Jams, which is where they got the concept of the family from. It was a musical group. It's not a cult by any stretch of the imagination. And Helter Skelter was actually a gambling club that was set up at Spahn Ranch. It was an illegal gambling club that was set up by Charlie, and we know this because the police raided it, and they, the door that's got Helter Skelter on is the door to the club, essentially. So yeah, this is the thing. But Terry Melcher had been interested in Manson for like a good couple of years, and they'd put a huge amount of money. He'd even been over at Brian Wilson's like home studio and recorded about 3 hours worth of like music, which was then later destroyed by the Beach Boys manager, whose name escapes me, but was also definitely connected to the mafia. So again, there's that angle that runs through it as well. And yeah, it's just say it's crackers, isn't it? It's like it's incredibly layered, like and very, very this well, you've got a huge amount of people involved with it as well over like a period of 3 years. And again, it touches on all these aspects, the connection with Dennis Wilson and living with Dennis Wilson, like Brian Wilson, like recording at his home studio, etc., etc., etc. And apparently he was quite charming. Like, who was it? I forget Brian Wilson's ex-wife. I can't remember her name, but she apparently says, yeah, they were really sweet guys, actually, really nice. Like very pleasant and polite around us, and it was erroneously sort of reported that she hated the Manson, all the dirty girls around there and stuff like that. Apparently, the only quotes I've found is she's basically saying very polite, very nice young man, essentially. So yes, again, it's just it is just a fascinating case, really.
So when it comes to the quote unquote family, do you think that they were all recruited by Manson himself, or do you think that many of them were plants? Because they seem to be planted, the main characters at least.
I've not really thought about it like that, to be quite honest. I suppose that would tie in with the sort of Operation Chaos type theories and stuff like that. Personally, no, because I just thought that he'd slowly built an entourage. First it was Mary, then it was Squeaky. Then was it Patty joined, then Wish, and then Lake, and then it just kind of built from there. And the thing is, once you've got this group of girls, then Paul turns up. Gypsy's there as well, and then basically after Paul's turned up, some bikers might get involved and stuff like that. So I think it more really sort of grew kind of organically, to be quite honest, because they lost people as well. Like Dina Martin fell out with she came along to it because she was friends with Brenda, and then she fell out with the group and so didn't move with them. Angela Lansbury's kids, Dee, Deirdre, and Tony, they were floating around with the Manson group for quite a while. Like, it was funny recently because Angela Lansbury died quite recently, and I read so many mentions that the Manson thing, and they totally glossed over the fact that Angela Lansbury had basically given a handwritten note so that her heroin addicted 14-year-old daughter could drive around with Mr. Manson's ministries without the police taking too much notice of it. And and just before the murders and whatnot, Lansbury sort of whisked Tony and Deirdre away. I think she took them to Ireland actually and got them clean of heroin, which is obviously a good thing. But Debbie Harry very nearly joined. I think she turned down a lift from the black bus. They originally had the little black Volkswagen camper van. I'm pretty sure she turned down a lift from them, but she also turned down a lift from Ted Bundy at one point as well. So Debbie Harry, like I don't know whether you'd look at that as unlucky or lucky, I suppose. But yeah, so she's been involved with sort of like nearly taking lifts from sort of two of America's most sort of serialized killers, or whatever you would want to call them. Obviously, I know Charlie didn't kill anybody, but yes, no, I don't think they were plants. I think that the group sort of grew a bit more organically. They just sort of like were picking people up as they sort of went along, and they were kicked off a lot of people. They were kicked off like what's his name? Wavy Gravy, Hope Farm were kicked off there. They were kicked off a couple of communes because they didn't want to do commune life. This was the other thing as well. Like when people try and sort of connect them to say the Church of Final Judgment or Scientology and stuff like that, they picked and chose like bits that were helpful to them, but they certainly weren't members of the Church of Scientology or the Process Church of Final Judgment. How do we know this? Because they didn't give them all their stuff. Like, do you know what I mean? If you're members of those two groups, you have to give them all your shit, basically, and you have to turn up to their lessons and be part. There's no point being part of a cult if you just turn up every other Saturday or whatever. Like it doesn't work like that. So we know that a lot of these assumptions or these sort of like things that were sort of laid on them weren't really true. Essentially, it was just there to bolster the idea, all of it, the Christian event and stuff, that the white supremacist stuff, the helter-skelter stuff, even that idea, the idea that it was actually a satanic cult, that there were satanic murders that were connected to the Process Church of Final Judgment. Do you know how that actually came into the public sphere? It was through Ed Sanders, obviously, who wrote The Family. But here's a very, very, not a lot of people know this, but like where Ed Sanders got that information from, he got it from Vincent Bugliosi. Right? Why did Vincent Bugliosi tell a reporter who was sort of connected to the underground press in San Francisco that the Manson case, the real scoop on the Manson case, was that it was satanic? Well, because basically he's trying to paint a picture in the mainstream media. When I picked up the Family the first time and went, oh, it's satanic, you've tacitly already accepted that it's a cult. Not only is it a cult, but it's a satanic cult. That's really, really important to sell the helter-skelter idea, because we're even near thinking that it's just a drug murder. Why did Vincent Bugliosi put it out in the underground press rather than just do it in the court case or release it to the newspapers? Because it's not true. Because it's not even close to being true. And if we'd have done it that way, then he'd probably got sued, just like Ed Sanders got sued, which is why basically, like in later editions of and versions of The Family, it doesn't refer to the Process Church. It refers to a satanic cult or a quasi-satanic cult or something, and that's because they sued it, because it's not true. It's absolutely not true. But it gives it that credibility because it's coming from an underground source, etc., etc., etc. But this was what was very, very clever. Like there was a huge PR movement to put all of these things onto the character of Charles Manson. Like, first they tried desperately hard not to solve the case, losing evidence, not finding the bloody clothes, not collaborating or cooperating with each other. Then basically, like Susan Atkins, I think she actually confessed to about 5 or 6 people before they even started taking us seriously. Because again, they were like, this is nonsense, you didn't do any of this. Like, why do you, like, Susan Atkins, like she confessed to the murdering Sharon Tate when she was inside. She was actually picked up for the death of, oh crikey, what his names keep falling out of my head. The lad that Bobby killed, their friend, why can't I remember his name? The chap with the glasses that they cut his ear off, Gary Hemming.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So she's actually in prison for that. And basically, while she's in there, she's scared as all hell because Susan Atkins is full of shit. Like she talks a good game, but she's nonsense. So she starts lying about what crime she's actually done to impress people, probably to stop her from getting beaten up. So she tells anybody and everybody that she's murdered Sharon Tate, and about 5 or 6 people go, "Don't believe you. We just don't believe you. Like, whatever, don't believe you." And then, strangely, it was it Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard? Both women are very dubious characters. They've got like aliases, like 3 pages of aliases. And she told them, and they reiterated the story to guards. But what's interesting is if you watch how the story progresses, those 2 have clearly exaggerated it as well to make the story far more sexy. And again, why does these people who just so happen to be connected with people who are tangentially connected to the case are essentially running interference and creating the narrative that's palatable for the mainstream media? It's it's a setup right for the start, really.
Yeah, there seems to be an awful lot of overly convenient, superimposed ideals, and not ideals, but disruptions to the hippie movement and the love and peace ideas of the time. It just so happens in 1969, Manson gets out in the Summer of Love. He is released on it was March 21st, which was the spring equinox. So that's a very strange coincidence there. The Son of Man, Manson, is released on that day in the Summer of Love, and then they call them the Love and Terror cult. So it's like they're inverting the whole movement of the 60s.
Totally, but I think that was on purpose because it had been. It depends what angle you're looking at it from, because like that whole sort of movement, the involvement of Timothy Leary and Alice Stanley and various people like that, brought the Hood of Eternal Love, like, and the obvious intelligence sort of connections to them, like, it depends what you believe. Some people would have you believe that basically they thought that LSD was going to be like a drug like Soma in a Brave New World that would be able to sort of control people. Some people basically would say that, like, it was to incapacitate people because, like, if you'd sat around in a acid funk, you're not protesting against the government or the war movement or whatever. This is the thing. It was a whole time of complete sort of contradictions. Like 1967, Summer of Love. At the same time, you've got like I think I forget exactly the date, but you've got the war in Vietnam going on. You've got, like, something. I think on the day that Manson got out, something like 25,000 college-age kids, like American kids, died in Vietnam. Like, as well as being called Summer of Love, it was called Long Hot Summer because there was something like 1,000 race riots in America that summer. So it's an incredibly tumultuous time. This is the thing. You've got when you've got some things that are looking like very, very sort of progressive. We've got some things that are basically harkening back to sort of very, very sort of disturbing times. You've got like the murders of students at Kent State. You've got the assassination of various important figures, the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, etc., etc., etc. It's such a sort of like boiling pan of incredible sort of like emotion and stuff going everywhere. But I think you're absolutely right that they did invert that because it was a way to delegitimize the hippie movement, which is it's anti-war, it's anti-capitalist, it's not anti-America, but it's anti a lot of the things that very rich people in America are used to be the sort of the system in America, essentially. So yeah, that's what, again, this is what makes it such a fascinating case, because you could just take that one angle of it. How involved was the CIA in the LSD movement? Incredibly involved. But does that mean that nothing good came out of it? Does it mean that everything was a plan, or did they just sort of like drop some stuff there and go, let's see what happens? Like, I'm very suspicious that again, the Weather Underground actually were there to discredit the SDS and the Black Panthers. Like, the whole time you've got influences of like the battles between Malcolm X and Farrakhan and stuff like that. It's such an incredibly sort of like vibrant period of not only American but world history, and then you drop these figures on top of it. It depends how you look at it, doesn't it? Like you could say, well, there's so much going on that there's bound to be patterns going on. But then, as you say, you look at these things, it's like equinoxes and the involvement of the Church of Satan and the involvement of like Scientology, which also has got potential connections to CIA and stuff like that. You can see why people would go down different strands, or would believe the more conspiratorial things, or would believe the Ed Sanders version of it, or believe the Mae Brussel version of it. You could even see why, in such a crazy time, that people would believe the Bugliosi version of it. Do you know what I mean? Because basically, like,
or even the Miles Mathis version of it.
Oh Christ, no! If anyone believes that, they're a fucking moron. Like,
I think there's a lot of theater involved there.
but there may well be theatre, because you've got to appreciate that basically, like, you know, you've got to cover up right from the word go, right from the discovery of the thing. You know, Robert Evans, Jack Nicholson, and Rudy Altobelli, who's also a drug dealer who happens to be connected to the mafia. They're in the house before the investigation is concluded, tidying it up, which I think everybody's taken as a euphemism for they were removing drugs or pornography or anything that might be considered embarrassing. But they must have got the tacit agreement from the police in order to do that. Like, in fact, they must have been fairly public in doing it. Otherwise, how on earth would anybody know about that? And again, they obviously didn't clean it up, because the bloodstained carpet and pig written on the door and such like that, they remained for years. Rudy Altobelli, basically, once he moved back into the flat, he insisted that the carpets were kept the same, because he thought of it as like a sort of a grim sort of murderabilia item, really. Like, I mean, the door, I think Pig was still on it in the 90s, because Trent Reznor ended up taking the door, didn't he? So
right.
whether Pig was still written on it or not, I don't know. But he certainly, nobody thought he was important. There was a studio set up there, wasn't there? The Marilyn Manson album was recorded there, and further down the downward spiral. But again, you know, you could tie that in if you were so minded to go, oh, Marilyn Manson recorded an album there. Yeah, there you go. Like, but yeah, again, it's fun, isn't it?
So with that, I'll let you wrap this up with this question here. Why is the Manson murder still highly important to examine and analyze today, all these decades later?
Well, I mean, from the mainstream perspective, I suppose it's because it's a fascinating slice of history, and it could show how, you know, groups work together, and how one nefarious influencer could, you know, take kids down the wrong path and stuff like that. Why I think it's interesting is because it is indicative of, this is one of the sort of most well-known and yet not well-known cases. Like, do you know what I mean? Everybody, I would guarantee, basically 90% of people in America, if you said Charles Manson, they go, oh, yeah. But if you asked them about the case, they'd have a vague idea. Most people think that Charlie killed a lot of people, and he obviously hasn't actually killed anybody. Like, and then again, there's so many different angles to look at it. Why I think it's important, because it's indicative of, this is a massive true crime thing that is clearly full of holes. Just the idea of helter skelter, right, being the motive. It's like, all right, I'll take that. All right, let's just take that as read. Helter skelter is the motive. Why did they stop killing people? And furthermore, why did they start killing people before they'd found the underground cavern? Because the concept was that they're supposed to find the underground cavern, and that was where they'll be safe whilst this civil war's going off. They didn't find it, so they haven't got their hidey hole. And furthermore, that after those two murders, they sodded off even further out into the desert to the Barker Ranch. If the point was to spur on a race war, why didn't they commit more murders? Why didn't they leave further clues? There was paw prints, and there was watermelon rinds in the sink and stuff like that, but it's hardly really conclusive proof that this was a black crime, and it's certainly nothing like evidence that this was a black crime incited by the fact that the victims were white. So why not leave an afro comb, or why not phone up the police anonymously and say, I saw two black guys leaving the Tate house at X o'clock or whatever. Anything like that. It doesn't stand up to the barest amount of scrutiny. And then when you find out that basically it's appropriated from Christian event, and you find out that all the other aspects of it are not true, like the fact that he's got a swastika. The swastika is supposed to be a sun wheel, and he took it off a Native American called Walks on Top that he'd been in prison with before, and he'd previously, this guy Walks on Top had got a swastika tattooed on his forehead, but he was an inverted swastika, which Charlie's first one was, until that was burnt off, and then he had it tattooed back on his forehead, and it was the right way around. But it was to protect Walks on Top from white people. It was a protective sun wheel. Now, are we naive enough to think that Manson wouldn't realize that basically putting an inverted swastika or a front swastika on your forehead would make him seem a bit of a scary, intimidating dude? But this is, again, the other thing, like Charlie happily took on the role once he realized that basically, like, you know, not getting out of this. Did he take on the role? He kind of did. He kind of plays up to it to a degree, but actually he's always said throughout through his interviews that he's he's innocent, and that he's not a hippie cult leader, and that it's all bunk and stuff like that. And so this is the thing. This is what fascinates me. Okay, right? Like, you know, there's loads of things at the minute, like true crime, making a murderer, cold cases, the staircase, all of this stuff, you know, people looking at different aspects of it. The Manson case, if someone was to do a Netflix series, like I don't think they will, because it would be too explosive, because, you know, it speaks to this corruption and cover-up. It speaks to the heart of the American establishment, isn't it? It's Hollywood. It's an institution. And to find that that's connected to the mafia and drugs and covering up of murders of young starlets and stuff, and blaming an essentially innocent person and concocting this idea of a hippie cult leader, it's incredible. But it wouldn't take much doing for somebody to do a Netflix series like that would basically, like, you know, by episode 1, you explain just that thing about, well, if it's Helter Skelter, why didn't they stop? And how come the story that basically is the foundation of the Helter Skelter myth isn't about Charlie, it's about Christian Ventnor? Oh yeah, done. It's done. The whole theory is done. So you need to find out the truth by that point. And the truth is that it was a grubby drug murder. It was Tex. It was Tex. Like, is Charlie stupid for basically going, I'll wash my hands of this, I'll put this in the capable hands of Tex? Yes, he's an absolute idiot. And he probably, like, there's even an argument that he foresaw this and he just didn't mind being back in prison or whatever. Like, or if that's going to happen, that's going to happen or whatever. But again, all of these things contradict one another. If he's putting it in the hands of this guy that basically goes against his wishes, where's the cult aspect of that? Where's the total control? Like, none of it adds up. None of it, like, if you start to pick at threads, holds together. But what does hold together is that there's that seamy underbelly. It's that story of a group of friends that were involved in drugs, a group of friends that were involved in Hollywood and the music industry, and all the characters, the organized crime aspect of it, and all the characters of it that overlay. And that's what it is. That's the fascinating story. That's why it's important, because it's a little vignette into American crime and Americana. And it's fascinating because, again, the real story is actually far more interesting than the cover-up.
Yeah, I would suggest anybody who wants to start studying into the Manson murders, start with Charles Manson's interviews themselves, because he speaks so much more truth than a Vincent Bugliosi or a lot of these guys who have supposedly covered his story. So Neil, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And so how can my listeners find you? Do you have any plugs, promotions?
Well, first off, I've got a podcast that hopefully people will be interested in. We've been doing it for about coming up for a year now. It's called Some Dare Call It Conspiracy. Like we, as people might have picked up, I kind of like a conspiracy theory. So what we do is we like to look at conspiracy theories and give them a fair go. Like it's not a debunking channel, it's not a promotional channel. It's let's have a look at it. Let's have a look at all the facts, how it's presented, how it's laid out, and then we appraise it, see if we have any legs. And we're doing all right. We're getting there, basically, but we could always do better. So if people want to listen to that, it's on Spotify, it's on Apple, it's on YouTube. It's called Some Dare Call It Conspiracy with Neil Sanders and Brentley. So that's one way people can find me. I'm on Twitter, Neil Sanders MC. I'm on Facebook, Neil Sanders. My website is neilsandersmindcontrol.com. If people are interested in the Manson book, it's available either on Amazon or you can get it direct via my website. It's also available on Kindle if people would prefer an electronic copy, and or you can get the PDF version from my website as well. So yeah, if people are interested in it, it's that's where it's available.
All right, Neil. Well, I thank you sincerely, and you keep doing what you do, brother.
So thank you very much.
All right, take care. The darkest darkness is that which remains unattended by prying eyes. The greatest lie is that which goes untouched by carriers of truth and curiosity therein. The most disruptful chaos is that which is untrodden by the marching foot soldiers of the order of reality. Evil, terror, and the nightmares of decades past persist as tomorrow's perpetual horror show where logic, reason, and sanity is brushed aside in favor of the fear. Here in ignorance and avoidance, the midnight shadows rule the room. Yet the brightest light is not that which shines into sunshine, but that which guides us from the tunnel. Dread not the darkest darkness, my friends, but know it as your moment to rise and shine most brilliantly. Love, peace, happiness. Signing off. Deuces.